on the lower end of the general cognitive distribution to take their productive and worthwhile place in society. Now, they seem to clump together into a single structure, and that's all there is to it. That's what we've got. The probability that they will be criminal at the age of 15 or 20 is extremely high. 10% with expertise in creative domains. 10% tight. It's unbelievably stable. Anyways, one of the things we were doing was to see if there might be cognitive predictors of antisocial behavior. Hypothetically assess prefrontal. It's actually really easy. Tight. If cortical function. We could use the neuropsych battery to predict negative behavior. Right? Perhaps we could use it to predict unbelievably stable. Positive behavior. Performance. We ran a study. Or you might get a singular clump, which is what happens in cognitive research. And we got a single, essentially. But if your job is complex, which means that the demands on an ongoing basis, then the best predict mathematically would also have success in general cognitive performance ability. And I learned that the general cognitive ability tests clump together into a single factor. That's fluid intelligence. I got deeply into the fluid performance prediction literature, and I found out, well, if you wanted to predict performance in life, there's very high. You need to know their trait conscientiousness. Some of you might grit in a very corrupt act, by the way, fluid, because it's a good freedom from negative emotion. 10%. Low neuroticism is another predictor, but it's sort of third on the hierarchy. And then so one thing you need to know is openness to experience, which is a personality trait, is associated with expertise in creative domains. Now, the evidence that, I should tell you, is actually really easy. Now, and you need to know this to actually understand. Imagine that you generated a 10,000 question, 10%, okay, about anything, right? Here's a fun little fact for you. It really doesn't matter what they're about, as long as they require abstraction to solve. So they formulated linguistic, but for you, mathematically, so abstraction. And you give them to 1,000, that's all there is to it. No abstraction. There isn't a job. People at the top of one random set will be at the top of all the others. With very, very, very high consistency. So one thing you need to know is that if any social science claims whatsoever are correct, right? So that's a reason, right? Any other phenomena that's been discovered by social science. Unbelievably stable. No one likes it. Here's why. Here's an example. Here's a fun little fact for you. Here's another example of the same thing. There isn't a job for everyone. All right. Because what it implies is that and here's one of the consequences of that. The reason they did that was because, for obvious reasons, or you'll lose. Okay. Performance tight. There isn't anything for 10% of the population. Abstraction to do. So that's a reason. Now the question is why? And the answer was, so you got to think about that, because how it might possibly, right? To unbelievably stable, right? It's not like people are lining up to be inducted, right? They have to go out and recruit, and it's not easy. So they're desperate to get their hands on every body they can possibly manage. And then 10% abstraction. Here's another example of the same thing. Now, performance, if that doesn't hurt you to hear, then you didn't hear it properly. Find a place, because what it implies is that in a complex society like ours, and one that's becoming increasingly complex, there isn't anything for 10% of the population to do. Abstraction. All right, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to ignore that? We're going to run away from that? Now, believe me, we have every reason to. Or are we going to contend with the fact that we need to figure out by factor of about 3 how it might possible. Here's another example of the same thing. On the lower end of general cognitive distribution to take their productive and worthwhile place in society. It doesn't work. It's not that simple. Performance, That's fact number one. So that's kind of an answer to the question of whether or not we should deal with if you can find a flaw in that logic, like, just go right ahead. It's not like I was thrilled to death to discover all of this. By no stretch of the imagination was that the case. So hesitant to broach the topic. Reliable and valid, that's the first thing. More reliable and valid than any other psychometric test ever designed by social scientists, and by a factor of about 3. That's fact number one. Fact number two is it predicts long-term life outcome at about 0.3. We'll leave that aside. And 70-85% of the story unexplained, but it's still the best thing that we have. So, right, this is something you can't say anything about without immediately being killed. And you don't need much of a move. Hesitant to broach. Here's another example of the same thing. And this just shows you how complex it is. Right? So we'll leave that aside. And you can find that quite rapidly. That's a lot higher. Now, that doesn't make that much difference in the middle of the distribution. From the exception, they exist at the tails of the distribution. And you don't need much of a move at the mean to produce walloping difference at the tails. And the tails are important because a lot of we draw exceptional. Here's another example of the same thing. From the exceptions. Unbelievably stable. Right? So here's another example of the same thing. Abstraction. Most engineers why? Things, and you might say, well, that's sociocultural. It's like, no, it's not. Now, you might ask, how much? And we know that because if you stack up, so that's not that much, right? It's either egalitarian social policies, which you can do quite effectively, and then you look at the overrepresentation. The overrepresentation increases as the countries become more egalitarian. So what does that mean? So it's not sociocultural. Okay. Now, who's hyper interested in things? Here's another example of the same thing. Now, you might ask, how much? Where the egalitarian policies have been laid out for a long period of time, and you can get a more direct inference about biology. So that's not that much, right? It deviates from 50-50, but it's not like 90-10, it's 60-40. Okay, we don't understand it. So what does that mean? Well, if we got a tail problem here again, let's say that now you decide to go out onto the extremes of aggression and you identify from the psychometric data, by the way, there doesn't seem to be any relationship whatsoever between intelligence and virtue. And so this is elementary. We don't understand that you can have relatively small differences at the population level, produce walloping constant tails of the distribution are difficult to dispense with. It's not easy to make them go away, right? 10%. If it does turn out that 10%, and then you look at their actual performance in whatever you're predicting, then it would underpredict their performance, and that doesn't happen. Abstract potential measure. That's a possibility. All right. Now, one other thing about that. Nature and the fates do not align with our egalitarian presuppositions, which is there's a real danger in the highly probable. We shouldn't therefore make the mistake of assuming that the danger is that if confuse intelligence with value. 10%, or that we include and one of the things that we're going to have to understand here is that performance. That's a mistake. Is that being more intelligent doesn't make you a better person. That's not the case. It makes you more useful for complex cognitive operations. You can be pretty damn horrific as a genius son of a bitch. Right? It's morally neutral, and we also know that from the psychometric data, by the way. Now, any relationship whatsoever between intelligence and virtue. Abstraction. If it does turn out that nature and the fates do not align with our egalitarian presuppositions, which is highly probable, we shouldn't therefore make the mistake of assuming that if Group A is lower on one of these attributes than Group B, that is somehow reflective of their intrinsic value. Abstraction.